Hi, Andy Maldonado here, and we're continuing our study and dialogue about culture and how, as a Christian, we are affected by the culture. So I welcome you to Swimming Against the Current, a Truth Quest series, and this is part 2, a deeper examination of the culture. The last time we talked about culture, we defined a very basic culture, which was kind of a genesis of culture. And we talked about Genesis chapter 2, where the Lord placed the man. He created Adam, and he placed him in an environment, in a context, we called it. And that context had boundaries. It had plenty of liberty, but it also had an accountability attached to it. And that accountability was marked by not being able it's not that he was not able, he was instructed by the Lord not to eat of a certain tree. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that was the boundary line. And if you're wondering why the Lord would choose that tree over the other tree, which was the tree of life, it was because Adam's understanding of good and evil was not supposed to come from his context. It was supposed to come from the Lord himself. So when we think about the culture that was established in the Garden of Eden, it was a culture where man, Adam, and then later his wife, and so on and so forth, Eve, would look to the Lord and to the Lord's standards and the Lord's values. So that was the original culture. It was a culture based on a trust in God to get the information needed in order to live your life. So, and of course, if you read on, you know that sin entered into the world. And that entered through Satan, the devil, Lucifer, who was in the body of a serpent, came and tempted Eve and deceived Eve to move away from the culture that God had designed for them. And of course, what he attacked was her understanding of God's instructions and her ability to trust God for what she needed and what they needed. In turn, Adam also disobeyed. So that began can I say it this way? That began a counterculture way back. And so there have been these two roots, these two trees of culture growing in the same context. And all through history, we see these two veins, these two rivers of culture. So when you look around and you try to define culture, of course, like I said in an earlier video, we try to define it by the latest fad, by the latest, music, clothing. We try to define culture, by nationalities. I have the Spanish culture, I have the black culture, I have the European culture. So all of those are contributing to this thought of culture. But a culture is what values you live out. And the more people live out a certain value system, well, they develop a culture. They walk in a culture. So what we saw coming out of the garden was that there was two cultures competing with one another. And that's why I said that there's one culture that is from God, and there's one culture that is developed by the devil, and it is anti-God. It's evil. And so all through history, you have these two cultures kind of competing within the context. And I want to get to modern day, because I have some historical stuff that I want to share with you. I live in America. I don't know where this video will wind up, but just for context sake, I live in America. So I'm going to talk about the American culture. But this could very easily transfer itself to European culture, South American culture, Caribbean culture, you name it. And the American culture has also two roots. Two roots. Now, I'm going to show you a map that was developed by John F. Smith, and he developed this in 1888. And what he was looking at was the roots of the American culture. He was looking at the biblical roots of the American culture. And as you're going to see on this map that I'm going to have overlaid in this video, and we'll discuss it more in detail, you'll see that there were two colonizations of America. When the ships came over from Europe, which was known as the Old World, came to the New World here in America, they settled in two places. And one of them is going to be very, very familiar to you, and that is Jamestown. Okay, the ships that came over to Jamestown settled there in 1619. But a year later, in 1620, another ship came over further up what we call the American East Coast today, and they settled in Plymouth. So as you're going to see from the map, and I'm going to stop here so that I could develop this map for you. You're going to see the two colonizations, or better yet, the two cultures that entered into the New World, America. Okay, what is now the United States, but in those days it was the Americas. And these two ships landing in two different parts of the American Northeast, one in the American Northeast, the other one in the American, what is known today as the American South, South Carolina. They landed there, but their roots were completely different. So I want you to bear in mind what we just talked about, the roots that were in the book of Genesis, okay? Because there was two cultures that came out of the book of Genesis. There was the original culture laid by God, and then there was the counterculture laid by the enemy. These two cultures have existed together through history, and we see them here coming to the Americas. And it's very important that you understand this if you're living in the Americas or if you're living wherever else. I'm sure you could trace some of this back to wherever you live, but here in the Americas, we can trace American culture here. Everything else that we have experienced as culture and cultural has been added to this. And the first one was in Jamestown, 1619, which you're all very familiar because a lot of media attention has been paid to 1619. But I want you to understand that a year later, another colony was raised. And it was raised by people who came to this area of the world looking for religious freedom. They were wanting to worship God. And that was in Plymouth in Massachusetts. And I'll have a lot more to say about that, but I want us to study this portion, and I want us to look at this map so that we can understand the roots of the American culture. God bless you, and I'll see you then. Okay, bye-bye. Hi, Andy Maldonado here. Just wanted to show you this map that I talked about in the video ahead of this. And this is the map that shows the two different cultures that are existing even today in our country. Now, I want to just take you back for a moment. We talked about in our last video how in the garden, God created a culture. God established the culture, his rule over his creation through Adam and through Adam's descendants. Now, that was the culture that God instituted for the benefit of his creation. But now, if you remember, in chapter 3, we're introduced to this serpent, to this creature that is in the garden, and we figure out and deduce from the scriptures themselves that in that serpent was the devil. And the devil was completely against what God wanted and God had created in the garden, that standard, that institution that God had created, his rule over his creation and his creation's liberty to exist under that rule. Well, Satan wanted no part of that. So he wanted to ruin that, just like he wanted to ruin God's rule in heaven, and he took a third of the angels and all of that. So here he got Eve, and then by extension Adam, to turn over the rule that they had themselves, turn it over to him. And so what he did was he created another culture. It was a culture of sin. It was a culture that was totally against the things God had created. So what we have here is a counterculture uh, to what God had created. And that's the culture that existed throughout history. So in history, what we have is this portrayal of this battle between these two cultures, the culture that God had created and God's effort to penetrate mankind and carve out for himself a people that will align themselves with that culture. And then you have this complete other culture, which is completely against the things of God and is more in favor of the sin of the flesh. So we have this culture throughout history. Okay, so when you read from Genesis 3 on, to Cain and Abel and all the way through, you see this portrayal of two cultures and God constantly trying to, get his people, get creation. He had Noah, he had others, and he was trying, but because the cultures were constantly at war with one another, there's always been this conflict. Now that's the story of history. Now we live here in America, and we are also dealing with those ramifications of what happened in the garden, right? I mean, the Bible is all about telling us about this war, this battle that is going on. And I have this map here because I wanted to illustrate a couple of the things that we have in our society and are very illustrated in this map here. Now, this map, for those of you that have never seen it before, this is a map made by John F. Smith, who was a abolitionist back in the 1800s, early 1800s, as a matter of fact, and totally against slavery. And he was a political person who wanted to show the evils of slavery. And he made this map showing two trees. Okay, so there were two trees growing in the country, and the name of it is historical geography. Again, they got the man's name was John F. Smith, and you can easily get this by just Googling John F. Smith historical geography, and you'll get this map. Or you can go to the Library of Congress, and it's interesting reading that you see there at the bottom. All of these things here at the bottom are just chock full of understanding of this man. So you can read that if you're interested in this map. Though it was a political map, like I said, that's not the focus that I want to have on it. I want to show how those two cultures, those two cultures that were set against one another, came to this country, and they are existent to us today. And it will give you an understanding as to why we struggle. We struggle in this culture. We struggle against the currents, and they're getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And the battle is just getting stronger and stronger. So, but I want you to understand, kind of historically, a founding. Now, this doesn't explain everything, and I don't portray to say that this answers all the questions, but it does give us a bit of an understanding as to what's in this country that has brought us to this place where we're struggling. If you're a believer in this country, and you feel a struggle within you to try to live your values in a society that just seems to be adamantly against what you believe, and that's a reality. I don't want to create it as some sort of mystical or theoretical thing. That's a reality. That's a reality. But I don't want to digress. So let me go back here. Uh, this map, of course, is of the early United States, and these two cultures, if you will, made their way over from Europe. Okay, both of these cultures made their way over from Europe. What was going on in Europe in the 1600s? Well, you had all kinds of issues. You had the Spanish Inquisition was going on. All these other things were going on in Europe. So there was this great search for new land, new riches, depending on who you were looking at. But I want to take two different levels of agendas. Okay, number one was, and I'm going to put these, try to contrast these. Number one was the in 1619, and most of you will be familiar with that date because we have a lot of discussion around that date and Jamestown. So 1619, this ship, okay, which happened to be a slave ship, or has been come to known as a slave ship, came to Jamestown in 1619. Okay, so they came to Jamestown, South Carolina. Okay, and there, um, some stories say that because they had no food, they had these slaves, African slaves, on board. Not all were African slaves. Some were individuals who volunteered to come over as indentured servants and work there for their passage here in the colony. But some were, slaves. They were just stolen from Africa. Um, how they were stolen is a whole nother discussion, but they wound up here, and this particular ship, this slave ship, represents the corrupt, okay, the corrupt and inhuman side of man. Why? They brought humans over here to be slaves. Okay, and that's represented by this coin that you see here. I don't know if I can get further in on it, but there is a coin here, right here, and it represents greed, obviously. Okay, so that's one of those ships or one of those cultures. There was another ship that came from Europe, and they came over, and I'm going to change the color here so I can represent them. They came over in 1620, and most of us come to know, and they came to Plymouth, Massachusetts. Okay, and most of them we know the ship as the Mayflower, and on board were pilgrims. Okay, um, those are the names that they were coming to be known as. But really, what they were individuals who were in search of. They were being persecuted in England for their faith, Christianity, and they were given, hardly any choice in whether they were going to live there or not under the tyranny, and so a lot of them chose to, go to the unknown, go to what is known as the New World. Okay, this was the New World. And what they came here for was in search of religious freedom. They wanted to be able to worship God. Now, there are all kinds of stories. I haven't done all the research on it, but there are all kinds of stories where, after they got here, the curse of slavery moved up into that area in Massachusetts where Plymouth is, also became a slave trade post. All of those stories can be verified, not the purpose of why I want to talk about this. What I want to say here is that those two cultures that were at war, in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, that went throughout history and matured, came to this country in a span of 1 year, okay, between 1619 and 1620. Okay, these two ships, which by many accounts are the two foundings of our nation. These were the two early settlements of our nation. As a matter of fact, this ship was in search of a New England. So that's why, this is called New England, because that was their motives. Now, what did both of these ships represent? Well, obviously, the slave ship represented uh, the inhumanity and the lack of respect for human life in the form of slavery. And this map represents what happens, or in God's eyes, the curse that was placed upon this particular form. God cursed it, just like He cursed the garden, just like because of the sin that had entered, the garden was cursed. So did God curse this particular tree here in this nation. So there is a cultural ideology and narrative out there that sits under the curse of God. Why? Because it is based on a culture that is anti-God. I'm not going into all of the particulars of that. That may be something I'll do later. But right here, for our sake and the sake of understanding the currents that we swim against, that is one of them. And then there is this other tree, okay, which brought God's blessing. And that is the tree of liberty. Now, here I want to say this, because on the Mayflower there is something called the Mayflower Pact. If I'm teaching you world history or American history all over again, and you know all of this, just bear with me. But if you've never heard this before, okay, this is interesting to know. While this ship was like off land, they were out in the harbor, and there were about 200 people on board this ship, from all different walks of life. I mean, these weren't all Puritans. Some of these were just convicts that got on that ship just to get away from Europe, especially England. England says, take them with you. If you're going, you got to take them with you. And so you had a lot of people on this ship, not all looking for what the Puritans or the Pilgrims were looking for. But here is the interesting fact. They formed what is known as the Mayflower Pact. Okay? And on board the ship, these 200 odd people from different backgrounds decided that they would all live under the unity of liberty. Under the unity of liberty. So they made this pact that this land that they were going now to live in was going to be lived under unity and under God's direction. You can read the Mayflower Pact. The Mayflower Pact talks about their view of God and God's blessing on them, because they were going to be obedient to God, and they made a pact. Though some of them didn't even agree with it, they agreed to live that way. And then what we see here, or at least what John Smith shows, is that culture brought this thing called liberty. Now, I want you to think back to Genesis, to Genesis 1, where when God made Adam, He gave him liberty. He gave him liberty in the garden. He said, of any tree in the garden that you want, you can eat, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? So that is liberty. See, liberty and freedom are two different things. Freedom is you just do whatever you want to do.
Liberty means you have freedom within boundaries. And in this country, what we have is liberty. Liberty. There are standards. And that's the point of these two cultures. And that's the reason struggle, why we struggle in our daily lives, because we are always swimming against a current that is against God, against God. Oh, it may be for a lot of other things, but deep down inside, it is against God. And I'll have more to say about that in future lessons or future series that I put out. But what I'm trying to do here is give us a foundation so that we might understand what it is that we are struggling against. We're not just struggling against this political party or that ideology or these people. No, Paul said it best. Paul said we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but we wrestle against principalities, against powers, against evil in high places. So, what has come through history and has certainly been in our land, and we are experiencing this, is the power of these two cultures growing side by side, by side. And as you see from the map, one was built on the Bible, and I don't know if you could see it here. I'm going to try and zoom in. One was built on this coin right here. There's a coin right here. Okay, if you get the map, you can look at these things on a close-up basis. So one was built on greed, and one was built on worship. And come on, we live in a society today that is still built on the same things. So yes, you're trying to live in a society with values that come from an ancient standard that was given down to you. You're trying to live that in a society that just, hey, whatever goes goes, and nothing is true, and you make your own truth, and there are no standards, and you're swimming against that. You're swimming against that. So I'm going to stop here, but just to say that this is kind of the root that we find in our country today. And in the next series, next lesson, and the next video that I put out, I'm going to start to talk a little bit more about what you can do to swim against this current. Okay? So until I see you again, God bless you, and I pray this was helpful to you. Bye-bye.